Cognition and brain health. There's a couple of reasons why I wanted to dive into this on the podcast today. Number one is when I talk to people, this is actually a kind of a niggling concern that is in the back of people's mind is that kind of brain change and decline as we age. And so it's a really important topic to bring up. Number two is I've been diving into it a little bit because we've got a topic call coming up where we're going to be looking at this in the sense of focus and then brain health and all of that with our clients in the program. And number three is that I think that there is a whole lot of tie-in here to the discussion we had on our last episode, Ollie, where we're talking about focus in particular. And when I dug into this focus topic a little bit more, we sort of see there's a whole lot of links of this, the damaging effects of perhaps multitasking, lack of focus, the overwhelm that can come from that, and then how that actually impacts our brain health in the long term, cognition, and even leading into things like dementia and Alzheimer's risk and all those sorts of things. So when we're talking very much about, I guess, the more mindful aspects of this discussion, like how you set up your day, how you set up your environment, those sorts of things. But there's actually some pretty practical things in the sense of nutrition and whatnot that can impact brain health and whatnot as well. So we thought we'd dive down this pathway today. Ollie, we kind of made a little bit of a top tier list of the key things that tied into this. Number one being blood sugar, actually, which is perhaps not where people would think would automatically go with this discussion. But I've got some thoughts on this. Blood sugar has a huge impact on mental health. And in fact, type 2, dementia and Alzheimer's have even been labeled type 3 diabetes because there's such a strong link to blood sugar. But what's front of mind, what comes up for you when you think blood sugar?
Yeah, no, I'm just listening and trying to see. I guess the link back to the last episode being more behavioral and this episode being more physiological in regards to what steps we can actually take. And I think, as we kind of highlighted in the first one, the activities and habits that we have in our day are learnt, which means they can be unlearnt, right? Which ultimately just gives us a little bit more control over our ability to focus in a day, right? And I think one of the things that we always push back on is over pathologizing things to the point that you couldn't control anything about your own health. And I think when you go to both the productivity level, I think that really allows us to take control. If you feel that you have some form of attention disorder, or you are dyslexic like me, or you've got some sort of different way, or you perceive yourself to be unique to others in regards to your ability to focus. But whether that's right or wrong or not, you've still got your ability to train that focus a bit more. And I think when we look at that physiologically as well, there are components in your day that make a drastic difference. And I think certainly Alzheimer's and dementia, it's something that ultimately, when we look at the big things that really impact the quality of our life long term, like that's the really big, overarching, scary one that you really hope you don't get. And knowing that that's come up in my family as well, I'm very aware of that, and hopefully doing everything I can to keep it away. I've had my fair share, if not more, of concussions, and know that my noggin's probably not so happy there. So looking at things I can do to just improve and repair in some form brain health, I think a really big part of this. My wife's got epilepsy, so looking at ways to improve the, again, repair of neurotransmitters or support of those functions is super front of mind for me. And I think fundamentally, yeah, that overall concept of what can we control, what can we really do to generally benefit how we feel and how we function long term.
Yeah, it's actually a really good point. It's we can talk about the lack of focus and all that ability, or even the brain health side of things and the cognition and the potential mental decline. And you can, a label can quickly make you the victim of something. And I think bringing in actual things you can do to mitigate or change your risk factors there, that's where you need to go. If you're going to put a label on something, you need to provide some solutions of what you can do about it. And I think the brain health space is a super interesting one because we're understanding it a whole lot more, and there is so much that goes on out there, and a lot of it is determined by the little actions that we take on a day-to-day basis. If even things as simple as drinking enough water and whatnot can have a really big impact.
That was actually thinking about this earlier today, around the reason that you think you can't is the reason that you need to put more attention into it, right? Like if I'm dyslexic, then I'm going to spend more time focusing or being able to try program or design my day in a way to get more done, right? Because I know that I can think about something at a really deep level, but it requires quite a lot of attention. So I get really irritated when I'm getting 5 different messages and notifications all at the same time, because it's like, geez, it's going to take me 40 minutes to get back into this thing now, right?
Mm.
And just being able to really design or be very intentional around the things that I might be less than ideal at in order to improve. And I think any of these things that come up, like I have diabetes running in my family, or I have X, Y, and Z happening, is the reason I need to spend more time on it. Not woe is me, this is going to be bad for me, right? And I think it's just, it means I need to spend more time here. And I think, this becomes a classic growth mindset or fixed. Is it something that you're actively going to choose to find ways to improve and optimize as much as possible, or are you going to let life just take you where it takes you?
Mm.
And I think ultimately, if you're listening to this podcast, you're probably in the first. You're in the space where you're in a place where you're actively trying to make changes in order to improve the way you feel and function and operate long term. So, circle back around, a bit of a tangent, but you were talking about the blood sugar thing. And I think that's a really cool way to look at fuel of the brain. And I still remember a talk we did a couple of years ago now, maybe really, really, I guess, popular talk in the menopause space around the drastic shift, I guess, in how the brain is fueled
Mm.
as women end up in perimenopause and feeling like they're losing their keys and don't remember where they left the things and all sorts of stuff. And I think it's
Mm.
a really simple example of, quite a drastic hormonal change in that environment that causes women in the space to experience what that would feel like. And I'm not saying that's a sign of dementia, but it is a sign of kind of starving the brain of fuel. And
Mm.
knowing that you've made that link to, insulin resistance, etc., there is obviously a pretty strong link there to explore.
Yeah, I think the first kind of tie-in that most people will have experienced and actually felt is when they get a blood sugar low. Like when your blood sugar
Mm,
drops, suddenly you can't think of anything anymore. Your
yeah.
brain goes to mush, and you kind of obsess over food, or you obsess over something, or you get anxious, or you get angry, or you get out of control, of your mental clarity disappears. That's the first kind of really obvious link of how important blood sugar is for your brain, because your brain in that moment is having a bit of a panic attack because it doesn't have any fuel coming in.
Hmm.
Um, the other link with the blood sugar is that blood sugar, high blood sugar we know is not good for our blood vessels, and so the blood vessels that feed our brain, which is an incredibly hungry organ, are very, very tiny, and sugar way before, potentially before, other areas of the body do. And so if we're constantly having these spikes and falls of blood sugar due to, insulin resistance and whatnot, our brain is taking the brunt of that. It might have available fuel, but it's damaging all those little blood vessels that are carrying oxygen and nutrients to those cells, which then can lead to, actual neuronal damage, which is the early onset or the early beginnings of more significant cognitive decline. So we mess around with the idea and talk and throw the term blood sugar balance is thrown around so freely nowadays, but we don't take it as seriously as it should be because of how it actually does impact our brain and cognition in the long term.
One thing just on that point, I guess we got to really hit home before we dive into this more is how much dementia is something that starts in your 30s, right? It's something that you
Yeah.
don't want to wait until you're 60 to then try recoup what you can. If you're listening to this in your 30s, 40s, or even if you are in your 50s, but you're doing the steps you can now, we
Mm.
can only focus on what we now know rather than what we could try reverse 10 years ago. But really just highlighting and hitting home that point that if you're taking those steps to improve your health now, that's planting the seed for what that looks like in 20, 30 years, right? And I think just being able to create that immediacy around something that would otherwise be proactive health, right? And we know just from human behavior that things tend to be a little bit, I'll wait for it to be a problem until I fix it. I don't have time now. And I think brain health is one of those things just not to play around with too much, knowing that the impacts in your 30s, 40s, 50s will have a pretty drastic impact on what that looks like 60s, 70s, 80s.
The the typical age to get diagnosed with something like Alzheimer's and dementia is around about 70. But what they know now is that what was going on in the brain that led to that diagnosis started at least 30 years before. So you're exactly right, is that the issue is we don't really necessarily see the signs and symptoms and get the diagnosis until the condition has gone a very long way ahead. So it's really important to be thinking about it now, 50, 40s, 30s, or whenever you start thinking about it.
So let's look at this through more nutritional food parts where, okay, what are the key, I guess, patterns that we see or just food groups that we see coming through causing these big dips and dives, knowing we do a lot of work looking at this blood sugar control,
Mm,
seeing the spikes and then seeing the lows, right? And I think even just correlating that with, okay, if you eat something really high carb, a lot of us know that we'll get a sugar spike, but there's a less, I guess there's a lot less people that know that that spike turns into a crash, right? For a lot of people. So what are the foods that we see that
yeah.
people are eating majority of the time that are causing those crashes?
I would put it down to things like, well, breakfast cereals are a shocker. They're a first
Yeah.
one because there's no protein involved. It's just all carbohydrates. Um, uh, Bread and sandwichy type things may be less of an issue, but could be an issue. But sometimes they'll come with some meat or something in it and some fats, which can buffer that kind of blood sugar response. But anything that is just carbohydrates unbalanced with any kind of protein, fat, and fiber, which could slow it down through the digestive system, and it's just bad news. So sugar, sweetened drinks and stuff. Most people know that fizzy drinks and whatnot are not good for them, but anything that's just a pure carbohydrate is not that much different. So cereals are a big one. Bread that doesn't have anything with it, pasta, rice, etc., can all be a problem.
Or you're doing your toast with margarine or jam or something along those lines.
Yeah. Oh, toast with jam. Yeah, mate. Sugar straight in there.
Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, I think those sort of more refined foods, the beautiful thing about something like a glucose tracker is you find that you might find for you, Mandy, that banana kind of is absorbed well and you don't really bounce around that much. Whereas for me, it might go through the roof, drop through the floor, and then try stabilize somewhere around midnight, right? So, there is a personal element to this, and I think it also ties into the health of the human, the general fitness, muscle mass, etc. I really have to double down on this idea that if you have very low muscle mass, it's really likely that things spike around all over the show. So, seeing these people that we talk to quite regularly, where they've previously lost a lot of weight,
Mm,
but what's happened is it's been 50% plus muscle as well as body fat, and then they put the fat back on without the muscle, which means they didn't just gain back 10 kilos, they gained back 15 because there was that muscle that they did not rebuild, which is a really
mm.
bad spot to be in. It can be reversed, but it is something that just takes a bit more time. And being more intelligent in that fat loss pursuit is obviously why we reinforce this so much. But by having more muscle, you have more places to really shuttle that glucose, which has a drastic impact on really that stabilizing of blood sugar overall.
Yeah, it really does. I think this is why it's so important not to look at what someone else does and be like, well, they do it and they're fine. Because there's so many things that you're not necessarily taking into account, like how active they are, how much muscle they have, how much they're training, how old they are, what their hormones are doing, what's their stress level, all these sorts of things that are also the things that impact blood sugar. And that's why I really don't like, the one thing I hate, Ollie, is what I ate in a days
Yeah,
on Instagram. So I'm
yeah,
like,
yeah,
that is useless information to every single person on the planet because it
yeah.
means nothing to anyone except for you.
Hmm.
And so looking at what someone else ate and being like, well, they eat it and they look great,
Yes.
doesn't mean that that's going to work for you as an individual if it spikes your blood sugars and it, does all these other different things to you or doesn't support your level of muscle mass or whatever it is that you need in your body.
Yeah, I actually saw one the other day, right? And 20-year-old, 20 something in Bali, got no body fat at all,
Yeah.
and is allowed to, able to train for 2 hours a day, right? And he's having fruits for breakfast and carbs for lunch and carbs for dinner, and might as well have a carb midnight snack. And look at me, I'm lean, follow the same thing. I'm like, it's just terrible advice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's worth looking at. My little pet peeve, if we're going to go down this route for a second, is, oh, I'm the same weight as I was 20 years ago, so I must be okay. I'm like, dude, if
Mhm.
we did the same waist circumference measurement, you're about 10 centimeters or higher on your waist, which means that you've lost muscle and put on body fat, and you're the same weight, which means bad news.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think looking at that, where a lot of people um, use that scale measurement as the entire reference point of health. And as long as they maintain that weight, and I've seen this happen where people go vegetarian or they just try skip meals, etc., right, to try stay
Mhm.
the same weight. But what they're doing is never stimulating that protein synthesis in order to hold on to some form of muscle mass, and they kind of stabilize or manage to maintain weight. But you just see their arms, their legs shrink, and their belly get bigger. Yet
Yeah.
they're still the same weight. And I think that's really where right now or in 2 or 3 years not necessarily the biggest issue, but you start to look at that with your inability to keep body fat off or your ability
Mm.
to look after that brain health long term, that becomes a really, really big issue really quickly.
Yeah. Well, and actually the whole if we're going to stick with this kind of this diet cycling of you say drop 10 kilo potentially conservatively, if you haven't been doing that well, half of that's muscle mass, half of that's fat, and then you put on 10 kilo and you only put on fat again, and then you drop 10 kilo again and you
Mm.
lose some more muscle mass, and you do that cycle where you just become a fatter version of yourself at the same weight. There's multiple prongs to that. One, you're losing your muscle mass, which is your metabolic currency. So that's the thing that's going to keep your blood sugar stable and protect your brain in the long term, not to mention your bone health. But the other part of that is in those dieting phases, if you've been doing them through very low calorie deficit, you've also been not supplying your brain with the nutrients that it actually even needs to stay functioning well and be protected anyway. Like that, it's such a toxic cocktail for your brain health, 20 years from now, that we don't even realize because we might not be paying any kind of price now because our body's what's the word, resilient, like it keeps us going in the moment, but what's
Yep.
the cost in the long term is quite scary.
Totally. Yeah. And hey, I think you're going to get a ton of nuggets out of this, just generally how to look after your health and your body as a whole. But, we're trying to direct this towards brain health as much as you can. But, it just highlights how interconnected this all is, right? Your inability to just perform and function at a high degree, not to mention your brain, comes back down to these like key tweaks of just general strategic, big picture ideas. And I think that is a huge frustration for us where you can absolutely drop body fat quicker, but sorry, you can drop weight quicker, but is that going to be body fat? And is that going to be
Mm,
something you maintain long term? And I think brain is really where that, long term we see the grunt of it. The problem is it becomes a, aha, I told you so when you're 80, right? And one, I didn't want to be right. And two, now you're really paying the price for it. I think that's really where those
mm,
issues come through. Um,
mm,
Okay, so blood sugar, I think that's a really big topic. Hopefully, we've hit that one home. Looking at those sort of high sugary foods or even just refined carbohydrates that are causing those spikes. And also, if you've got a high level of, a very low level of muscle mass, then that just makes all of that stuff worse, right? So we've already ticked off two big ones. Muscle is one of those biggest organs in the body. If you can keep your body healthy and maintain muscle, that's just, as you said, that metabolic gold to making sure that you can function. And improve brain function and all these other aspects that we would associate with health into our 70s 80s plus. Beyond sugar control, just to put this back on you for a second, what are some of the other key ones that if we were really looking to include other steps outside of healthy lifestyle, nutrition, and of course muscle mass at this point, what are some big ones that we'd start to look at as well to improve the brain?
The other one that comes to mind, and it kind of ties, it's got fingers into all of these, is about blood flow to your brain. So your brain's the most hungry organ in your body. It's hungry for energy, but it's also hungry for nutrients. So it means there's got to be a really good blood supply to your brain. So this is where we come into hydration being key. Like getting dehydrated might not feel very good, but it's really, really bad for your brain as well. And so consistent hydration. I talk to a lot of clients about this when we look at their blood and we see these markers of dehydration, which can very often show up in a fasted blood panel because you've gone and got your blood test done first thing in the morning when you're the most dehydrated, is not necessarily that, okay, this is how you are all the time, but this is a snapshot in time and your brain has been dehydrated in this moment. And so when it comes to hydration, what we're not wanting to do is be like, oh, I'm dehydrated. So we then flood ourselves and drink, 3 liters of water in one go. But rather, how can you build this into your day so that you can be consistently hydrated all of the time? And I think that's a really important one when it comes to hydration, is that when we think, oh, I'm thirsty, we go and drink a whole lot, but it doesn't solve the 50% of our day that we spent actually a bit dehydrated. So hydration is super important in keeping that consistent. And then hydration then allows better blood flow because you've got more blood volume, which means you can move more nutrients to your brain and you can actually balance your blood sugars at the same time. But the other part to blood flow, which stop me if you want, but the other part to blood flow is movement of blood. And that is actually where the exercise piece ties in. So obviously exercise for muscle mass to improve blood sugar control, but exercise for your heart and particularly zone 2 to help move blood around your body to improve blood flow to your brain is also a really important component.
Yeah. So I guess both of those together, right? I think
Mm,
you mentioned it, but just to double down on that around hydration isn't just drinking more, but having those electrolytes present in order to really uptake that, right?
Mm,
And I think, as you said, in the same way that if you don't exercise at all, you certainly don't need any more salt. But if you are exercising, contracting tissue, and moving, not to mention sweating or it's hotter, having those electrolytes replenished is a pretty big part of that blood flow and hydration overall, right?
mm,
And I think looking at that space as something that I guess for a lot of people, even just that concept of, oh, wow, I didn't even think about that. Like, I didn't need to just drink
mm,
water, because we have seen people go the other way, right? Where they only ever really have, a couple glasses of water a day. They clearly need to drink more water, but now they're like, oh, I need to have 5 liters a day or 4 liters. And they drown themselves in water all day, and they don't actually replenish any of those nutrients. So it is one of these things that absolutely applies context, hence why we typically only add these recommendations in a podcast as opposed to an Instagram post, because there's
mhm.
always context, like the day in the life meals. There's always
Yeah.
context based on who am I talking to. But I do think that ability to look at hydration is a key part of just general all those other components of heart health and blood flow, and just making sure that general cellular health is covered, I think is a nice way to look. I'm not sure if I should go this straight away, but I'm going to add in the little. I guess you mentioned this before, and I think we can even dive into why. But looking at supplementation is something that a lot of us are really quick to go to when we look at brain health or performance or
Mm,
sleep or hormones. Like, oh, what's wrong with your hormones? Take this pill. What's wrong with your brain? Take this pill. We're so conditioned to that type of environment. And I think, we could have a list of about 3 or 4 different cognitive enhancers that we could address here. Um, One of them, for me personally, I will bring it up. Why not? Is alpha GPC. I really quite enjoy that as more of a like focus thing. If I really need to be, dialed in for a day, I'm not going to take that every day, but I do find that super helpful as more of a day-to-day supplement. Something like lion's mane, I find really helpful as well.
mm,
Is just kind of feeling a little bit sharper.
mhm,
But one of the ones that I think really ties back is, one, this whole, I think most of us have probably heard this before, but supplements is the icing on the cake. What we're truly looking for is the heavy hitters that really keep us in a spot that the body's healthy, the brain's healthy, and we can really feel that stuff long term. Where I'm going with this is the creatine side of things, right? Which is,
mm,
this is one of these supplements that if you're listening to this in your 40s, 50s, maybe your teenage son took this to put on some muscle in high school, and he started seeing a vein in his bicep. And I think there's all of these concerns around creatine being this big muscle building type supplement, and it is a very effective supplement to take in that form. It's one of the cheapest. It's one of the most effective. Like, if you want to take muscle, creatine's a beautiful way to go down. But the research, obviously, on a brain health standpoint, is the one that's really accelerated over the last, I keep saying 5 years, but probably 10 years now.
mm.
Um, Talk to me about the connection between obviously the hydration pit and then what comes in with the creatine.
Um, well, just for context, I've been taking 5 grams of creatine a day, and I still do not have a bicep vein, so maybe I need to take more. Yeah, creatine and the brain health thing, I think it's super interesting. Creatine is like the most studied supplement I think that there is. It's incredibly safe to take. Pretty much most people should probably be taking it. It is just an amino acid. We can get it from food, but we don't get it in the quantities that are therapeutic just from food alone. You have to eat something like, I don't know, I think it's like 75 kilos of steak or so. It's something ridiculous. Like,
That's
it's
a good
impossible.
day. Yeah.
Even Ollie couldn't eat that much. Um,
Like,
so
it'd be like our meal in Melbourne, Mandy, where we just do that
yeah.
every time. Just for context, I think was it a 1.8 kilo or 1.5 kilo? I'm not sure it was, but
No,
Mandy and
it's
I sat down at Melbourne when we arrived for a client workshop a couple of years ago, and we're like, right, here's dinner, and we finished it,
half
so
a
that was
cat.
good. But
Yeah,
then a
yeah.
couple of times a day we might hit
Yeah, yeah, we'd have to have breakfast, lunch, and dinner.
it.
The creatine thing to the brain, to be fair, it's not fresh in my head and on all the connections there, but there's a lot of research around. It's because it supports energy metabolism in the cells. And our brain is incredibly energy hungry. And so, if there's any issues with lack of supply due to blood sugar issues or blood flow issues or anything, then creatine is something that should be being added in there, because it's something it's a food-based nutrient. It's not like adding in a herb or something that you become tolerant or intolerant to, tolerant to. It's just putting in an extra dose of what you get from food anyway, and it just helps those pathways to run more smoothly. And there's some pretty good links with creatine being helpful in situations like depression and anxiety and mood disorders and whatnot. But from
Mm.
a cognition perspective, I think it's really important as well. And I guess tying to the hydration in a way, there's a potential if you're kind of going to that level of just excessive water consumption, which, like you said, we sometimes see, you say someone's a bit dehydrated and they fling way too far the other way and they actually lose a lot of your minerals and whatnot. You could be flushing out a lot of those nutrients that are important for your brain as well. So things like your sodium, potassium, and magnesium, etc. But then also those amino acids like creatine and whatnot too.
Yeah. I tend to look at it as a subsidiary of that sort of hydration point, or at least from the brains and the cells and muscles, etc. To just generally feel like, because you do, certainly when you take it from a muscle building standpoint, you do put on a couple of kilos, but it's hydrating
Mm,
the muscles to keep it in that space where you can perform at a high degree, be a little bit stronger, endurance is a little bit higher, etc. And if you
mm,
apply that same thought process to how you're hydrating the brain, well, at a simple level, that's going to help. Um, so we've kind of got the sugar spikes being the first one. We've got the second one being more of an overall blood flow / hydration piece, and then the third
mm,
one is just because you wanted it. We've added a couple of supplements in there, with the key one being that creatine, if not the alpha GPC and lion's
mm,
mane. But ultimately, what we're looking at is this ability to reduce the degrading of brain health, right? Because with this aging discussion, that until we find otherwise, it will happen to some degree. But as we know, we've seen 30-year-olds that look 50 and 50-year-olds that look 30. It's that ability to include those steps in your day that are fairly simple to adjust and improve your overall output, function, etc. And I think the brain is one of those ones that a lot of us are really concerned about, because it's not visual. It's not the wrinkle on your face or the lack of the bicep vein. It's internal. Yet it's probably the one that's truly going to impact us the most when we start. It starts with forgetting where our keys were. It starts to forget names. It starts to really go downhill quite quickly. And I think when through a traditional medical sense, there's fairly few answers with what that looks like from a dementia standpoint, rather than just try be next to them. I think
mm,
being able to do those steps now, it might save a lot of pain down the line, or at least extend that and give you more quality where you can.
mm. Yeah. Oh, and I had a thought there that brought that right back around to the start. Oh, yeah, I know what it was. It was around. I said at the start, it's a common fear that I see when we talk to people, of worry about that, because it tends to run in families. And just to throw this out there, that often there is a very, very small genetic component when it comes to Alzheimer's and dementia, but it's so small that it's in the 90s of percentage is avoidable potentially, or modifiable by diet and lifestyle. Um, and oh man, I've totally forgotten where I was going with that. Maybe I need some lion's mane. um,
Well, that concept overall
yeah.
that you're talking about, which is the ability to take control, or take control of what you can control, being the
Mm,
ability to address all of the 90% of stuff that is in your control, right? And I think if you
yeah.
use that label of like, this runs in my family, this runs in my family, then that's exactly the reason to address it and be more aggressive in your approach to really mitigate it as where possible. Because if you
Yeah.
let things slide, or you label them as being uh, so much more likely than they will be, because you're simply saying like, well, this is under my control.
Mm. And so often what runs in families is habits and
Hmm.
patterns more than anything. Like, yes, there's some genetics, but we often do what our parents have done, and they do what their parents have done, and there's these similar trends and whatnot, that we're maybe a similar amount of activity level of all of these things run in families as well. So you can be the person that stops that trend by changing what you're doing, so your children are watching a different pattern potentially as well.
Totally. Well, we'll look at the example of just, we've used this example with sort of the Kiwi versus, or Australian versus the Italian, right? Imagine that subtle difference in how they approach meals if that was the only thing that stayed constant through the 50, 60 years of their life, where they had their meal and they relaxed and they talked and they took their time to really allow that food to digest, and then they kind of flowed into the nighttime and then went to sleep, versus as soon as that meal is there, they hoof it down so that their brother doesn't nick some of it, and then they make sure there's always a dessert done, and then as soon as that's there, they're straight to the TV. They watch that until they're tired, and then they go to sleep. Like that one habit with
Mm,
dinner, just extend that by 50, 60 years, and that has a drastic impact to your digestion, your weight, your composition in general, your brain health, and so much more. So habitually, there is
yeah.
absolutely a component there, and knowing that there's a family element, there is a routines that just become automatic. That is a huge one to highlight as well.
Mm, yeah. We took that a lot of places.
We did.
Um, So if we kind of bring it back around and look at it from the context of brain health on the whole, which is a huge topic, big concern, very relevant, I think. I guess the key takeaways that I want to have people take away from this is one, how you set up your day does have an impact. Those things like overwhelm and stress and whatnot, but also how you set up your nutrition, how you move, and all those little habits that tie into it as well. Even like you said, you sit down and eat your meal and digest well, those sorts of things, they all really do have a big impact as well. And just to come back to the supplements thing, because I think it's important, little point there is none of those work until you do the other stuff first. If you just go straight to taking something like lion's mane, which I love personally myself as well, you're going to feel like it doesn't work, because it doesn't work if you don't have that nice foundation set up in the first place. So really putting the time and effort into doing those things first, and then add those extras on top as the cherry on the cake, is probably the way to go. So hopefully people have taken away some useful thoughts from this. We often say on these podcasts, we want you to stop, pause, have a think about it. What's the one thing that you're going to take away from this and actually put into your life? Because it's, we can be constantly cramming more information into our poor overloaded brains, but unless we actually take a piece of it and put it into action, we don't get any of the benefit of it anyway. So do your brain a favor, choose one thing and go and insert that into your day somehow going forward from here. And yeah, good luck with it.